The envelope sat innocuously on my desk, the plain white surface a stark contrast to the chaos of files and documents strewn around it. My heart raced as I stared at the unfamiliar handwriting scrawled across the front, Eloise Gibbons. Cautiously, I tore open the seal, half expecting a prank or some misguided advertisement. Instead, a single USB drive clattered onto the surface, accompanied by a note that sent a chill down my spine. Discover the truth about your husband's death. My hands trembled as I clutched the drive, memories of that fateful night flooding back. Duncan's fall from the deck during my brother-in-law Mark's party, the sickening thud as he hit the ground, the desperate attempts to revive him. The official ruling of accidental death had done little to ease the guilt and unanswered questions that plagued me. I stuffed the USB into my bag, my mind racing. Who could have sent this? And what sinister truth did it hold? The drive burned a hole in my thoughts as I hurried home, my workday abandoned. Mia greeted me with a cheerful smile, oblivious to the turmoil swirling within me. "Hi, Mom. Can we order pizza for dinner?" "Sure, honey," I murmured, forcing a smile. Once she was settled in front of the TV, I retreated to the home office, the USB drive clutched tightly in my fist. With trembling fingers, I inserted it into my laptop, bracing myself for whatever revelation awaited. The video player opened and my breath caught in my throat. There, clear as day, was footage of the party, but from an angle I'd never seen before. Duncan stood on the deck, engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with Mark. Suddenly, in a blur of motion, Mark's hands shoved against Duncan's chest, sending him toppling over the railing. The sickening crack of his body hitting the ground echoed through the speakers, and I had to choke back a sob. My husband's death wasn't an accident. It was cold-blooded murder at the hands of his own brother. Rage and betrayal coursed through my veins as I watched the footage again and again, each loop more damning than the last. Mark's smug expression as he peered over the railing, the casual way he sipped his drink before returning to the party guests. In that moment, a fire ignited within me, a burning desire for justice that consumed every other thought. I would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. For Duncan, for Mia, and for myself, I would make Mark Lawton pay for his heinous crime. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, but one thing was certain. I would not rest until I brought my husband's killer to justice. The footage played on a loop, each viewing more sickening than the last. I watched in morbid fascination as Mark shoved Duncan, the man I'd loved and trusted, over that railing to his death. Bile rose in my throat as the crack of his body hitting the ground echoed through the speakers. I lost track of how long I sat there, numb with shock and anger. Mia's cheerful voice from the living room snapped me back to reality. "Mom, the pizza's here." Hastily, I closed the video and shoved the laptop aside, taking a deep breath to compose myself. "Coming, sweetie." As we ate, Mia chattered away, oblivious to the storm raging within me. How could I possibly explain to my 10-year-old daughter that her beloved uncle had murdered her father in cold blood? The thought made me ill. Later that night, after Mia was tucked into bed, I pored over the footage again, studying every damning second. Mark's casual demeanor as he rejoined the party guests, his expression one of smug satisfaction. The monster had ended my husband's life without a shred of remorse. The question was, why? What could have possibly driven Mark to such a heinous act? Money troubles, perhaps? I knew Duncan had lent him a sizable sum a few months prior, but surely that wasn't enough motivation for murder. My mind whirled with possibilities, each more sinister than the last. I needed answers, and there was only one person who could provide them. The next morning I dialed Mark's number, my heart pounding in my chest. "Eloise?" His voice was cheerful, utterly devoid of the guilt I knew he harbored. What a pleasant surprise. I swallowed hard, steeling my nerves. "Mark, we need to talk. In person." There was a pause, and I could almost sense his hesitation. "Of course. Is everything all right?" "It's about Duncan," I said, my voice trembling slightly. I know what happened that night at your party." Dead silence greeted my words, and for a moment I thought the line had gone dead. Then Mark's voice, low and dangerous, crackled through the speaker. "You don't know anything, Eloise. But if you value your life and Mia's, you'll keep your mouth shut." The line went dead, his thinly veiled threat ringing in my ears. My hands shook with a mixture of fear and rage as I clutched the phone, hot tears stinging my eyes. So that was how he wanted to play it? Fine. If Mark thought he could intimidate me into silence, he was sorely mistaken. I would bring him down, no matter what it took. With renewed determination, I began scouring through Duncan's old files and records, searching for any clues, any hint of the dark secret that had led to his untimely demise. Mark's smug, callous behavior would be his undoing. This was no longer just about justice for my husband. It was about protecting myself and my daughter from the monster lurking in our midst. Mark Lawton had started a war, and I would stop at nothing to emerge victorious. Mark's chilling threat still rang in my ears as I pored over Duncan's files, searching for any shred of evidence that could expose his murderous brother's motives. Financial records, old emails, even scraps of handwritten notes, I left no stone unturned in my quest for answers. It didn't take long to uncover a disturbing pattern. Buried amidst pages of mundane transactions were numerous large cash withdrawals from Mark's accounts, all occurring within the months leading up to Duncan's death. Where had that money gone? And why had Mark been so desperate for funds? The pieces began to fall into place as I delved deeper, uncovering a tangled web of shady business dealings and questionable associates. Mark had been in over his head, drowning in debt and desperately trying to keep his head above water. A cold realization washed over me. My husband's death hadn't been a crime of passion, but a calculated act of greed and self-preservation. Mark had seen Duncan as his ticket out of financial ruin, and when my husband refused to bail him out further, he'd taken the ultimate step to secure his own future. Rage bubbled within me as I studied the evidence, each new discovery more damning than the last. This monster had taken the love of my life, all for the sake of money. He was going to pay for his sins, one way or another. Armed with my newfound knowledge, I began tailing Mark, determined to uncover every last sordid detail of his life. I followed him to seedy bars and underground gambling dens, watching as he schmoozed with an unsavory crowd of loan sharks and shady businessmen. This was the dark underbelly he'd been so desperate to keep hidden, the world that had ultimately led him to commit an unforgivable act. One night, as I discreetly observed him from across a dimly lit back alley, a burly figure approached Mark, his expression thunderous. "You're way behind on your payments, Lawton," the man growled, grabbing Mark by the lapels and slamming him against the brick wall. "I want my money, and I want it now." Mark's face paled, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. I'll have it for you soon, Polly, I swear. Just give me a little more time." Polly's meaty fist connected with Mark's jaw, sending him crumpling to the ground. "You've run out of time, pal. Either you pay up, or I start taking pieces off you and that pretty little family of yours." I recoiled in horror, clutching the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. So not only was Mark a murderer, but he'd also entangled himself with ruthless criminals who wouldn't hesitate to harm Mia if he failed to settle his debts. As Polly stalked away, leaving Mark a whimpering mess on the pavement, a cold sense of determination washed over me. I would bring this monster down, no matter what it took. For Duncan, for Mia, and for every innocent life he'd put at risk with his selfish actions. Mark Lawton's reign of terror was about to come to an end, and I would be the one to deliver the final blow. The dimly lit cafe was a far cry from the upscale establishments Mark frequented, but it provided the perfect cover for my clandestine meeting. Jenna Lawton eyed me warily as I slid into the booth across from her, no doubt surprised by my request to meet in such a low-key locale. "I have to admit, Eloise, I wasn't sure if you'd show up," she began, her voice tinged with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. I leveled my gaze at her, pushing aside the folder of incriminating evidence I'd compiled on her soon-to-be ex-husband. "I wouldn't have reached out if it wasn't important, Jenna." Her brow furrowed as she studied me. "Is everything okay? Has Mark done something to—" "Your husband is a lying, cheating murderer," I cut her off bluntly, watching as her eyes widened in shock. "And I have proof." Slowly, methodically, I laid out the damning evidence before her. The hidden camera footage of Mark shoving Duncan from the deck, the financial records detailing his mounting debts and desperate attempts to cover his tracks. As the gravity of the situation sank in, Jenna's face paled, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling against the tabletop. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I knew he was up to no good, but I never imagined. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, shining with unshed tears. Thank you for telling me the truth, Eloise. I don't know what I would have done if... I reached across the table, covering her hand with my own in a rare moment of tenderness. We're going to make him pay for what he did, Jenna. I promise you that. A fire kindled behind her eyes as she gave a resolute nod. Whatever it takes. From that moment on, an unspoken bond was forged between us. Two women wronged by the same vile man, united in our quest for justice. We pored over the evidence together, formulating a plan to expose Mark's crimes and bring him to his knees. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of clandestine meetings and meticulous planning. We knew we had to tread carefully, for Mark was already onto us and willing to go to dangerous lengths to protect his secrets. Finally, the night of our reckoning arrived, a high-profile charity gala that Mark was scheduled to attend. We had laid the perfect trap, planting an undercover videographer in the crowd and setting the stage for a very public confrontation. As Mark sauntered into the ballroom, all false bravado and empty smiles, my heart pounded in my chest. This was it, the moment we'd been waiting for. Jenna met my gaze from across the room, giving me a barely perceptible nod. Steeling my nerves, I strode towards him, the folder of evidence clutched tightly in my hand. "Hello, Mark," I greeted him coolly, ignoring the surprised murmurs from nearby guests. "I think it's time we had a little chat about Duncan, don't you?" His eyes narrowed as he registered my presence, his polished facade cracking ever so slightly. "Eloise, this is hardly the place." "Save it," I spat, throwing the folder at his feet and watching as the incriminating contents spilled out for all to see. "We know what you did, you sick bastard." The ballroom had fallen deathly silent, every eye trained on our confrontation. Jenna stepped forward, her expression a mask of cold fury as she leveled her gaze at her soon-to-be ex-husband. "How could you, Mark?" she demanded, her voice cracking with pained emotion. "How could you kill your own brother, lie to all of us, just for a quick buck?" Mark's eyes darted frantically between us, his usual bravado evaporating in the face of our united front. As the damning evidence played out on the videographer's camera for all to see, his shoulders sagged in defeat. All right, he snarled, his hands raised in surrender. "You want the truth? Fine, I was drowning in debt, okay? I needed Duncan's money to keep my head above water, but that self-righteous prick wouldn't lift a finger to help me. So I took matters into my own hands." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the gravity of his confession sank in. Jenna's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks, while I fought to keep my composure in the face of such despicable evil. In that moment, as the world watched Mark Lawton's sickening unraveling, I knew our quest for justice had been achieved. The monster who had torn our lives apart was finally exposed, left to face the consequences of his unforgivable actions. And as I locked eyes with the man who had once been my brother-in-law, I felt no pity, only a grim sense of satisfaction that his reign of terror was finally over. The ballroom erupted into chaos the moment Mark's damning confession left his lips. Shouts of outrage and disbelief echoed off the marble walls as guests recoiled in horror, drinks and hors d'oeuvres clattering to the floor in the pandemonium. In the center of the storm stood Mark, his face contorted into a mask of rage and desperation as he whirled to face the undercover videographer, capturing every sordid detail. "You set me up, you bitches," he snarled, rounding on Jenna and me with balled fists. Instinctively, I stepped in front of her, shielding her from his wrath. "It's over, Mark," I spat, my voice laced with a cocktail of fury and righteous vindication. "The whole world knows what a pathetic, lying weasel you truly are." His chest heaved with labored breaths as he sized me up, murderous intent burning in his eyes. For a fleeting moment, I feared he might actually strike me, that his depravity knew no bounds. But before he could act, a pair of burly security guards materialized at his side, clamping meaty hands around his biceps and dragging him backwards despite his enraged protestations. "Get your hands off me!" he bellowed, struggling against their iron grip. "You can't do this to me! I'm Mark goddamn Lawton!" Jenna stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a newfound fire as she stared down the man who had once been her husband. "That name doesn't mean a thing anymore, you disgusting excuse for a human being. Not after what you did to Duncan. To us." A muscle twitched in Mark's jaw as her words found their mark, but his bravado remained intact. "You think this is over?" he taunted, a cruel smile twisting his features. "You have no idea what kind of hell you've unleashed, ladies. No idea at all." A shudder of trepidation rippled through me at his ominous words, but I refused to show any outward sign of weakness. Not here, not now, not when we'd finally achieved the justice we'd fought so desperately for. "Take him away," I ordered the guards, my voice ringing with an authority I scarcely recognized. "And make sure he rots in whatever hellhole he ends up in." With one final, venomous glare in our direction, Mark allowed himself to be dragged from the ballroom, his disgusting presence finally extricated from our lives like a cancerous growth. A smattering of applause broke out among the stunned guests, quickly swelling into a thunderous roar of approval. Jenna and I stood shoulder to shoulder, basking in the glory of our hard-won victory as the crowd pressed in around us, offering congratulations and words of support. It was almost overwhelming, this outpouring of vindication and praise after months of secrecy and heartache. But as the adrenaline began to ebb, a profound sense of relief washed over me, carrying away the weight of months of anguish and desperation. It was finally over. The monster who had taken Duncan from me, who had threatened the very fabric of my world, was gone, banished to whatever grim fate awaited him behind bars. Jenna's hand found mine, giving it a gentle squeeze as she offered me a watery smile. "We did it," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "We got justice for Duncan." I could only nod mutely, too choked with gratitude and overwhelming release to find the words. After the long, harrowing road that had brought us to this moment, we had emerged victorious. A little battered and bruised, perhaps, but stronger than ever in our unshakable bond of survival. As the crowd parted around us in a daze of celebration, I knew that this was merely the first step on my journey towards healing. Mark's arrest was just the beginning. Now came the arduous task of piecing my life back together and learning to move forward without the shadow of his villainy looming over me. But I would face those challenges head-on, bolstered by the knowledge that I had stared true evil in the eye and emerged the victor. Duncan's memory could finally rest peacefully, avenged by the indomitable force of a wife's love and a sister's loyalty. And as for Mark, let him rot for his crimes, a cautionary tale of what awaits those whose greed and malice corrupt their very souls. His reign of terror was over, and ours, that of the survivors crafting a new beginning from the ashes of tragedy, had only just begun. The courtroom was a study in contrasts, the polished oak paneling and ornate chandeliers a stark juxtaposition to the palpable tension that hung thick in the air. Jenna and I sat ramrod straight in the gallery, our eyes trained on the defendant's table where Mark slouched sullenly, his once immaculate appearance now disheveled and unkempt. As the bailiff called the proceedings to order, I felt a surge of grim satisfaction watching the once mighty Mark Lawton reduced to a withered, pathetic shell of his former self. The months since his public unraveling at the gala had not been kind, stripping away the layers of bravado and hubris to reveal the craven coward lurking beneath. One by one, the damning evidence was presented. The hidden camera footage, the financial records detailing his mounting debts, even eyewitness testimony from those who had attended the fateful party that night. Each new revelation landed like a body blow, chipping away at what little remained of Mark's defiant facade. When it was my turn to take the stand, I leveled an icy glare in his direction, unflinching in the face of his seething contempt. "Mark Lawton is a liar, a cheat, and a cold-blooded killer," I stated, my voice ringing with conviction. "He robbed me of the love of my life and deprived my daughter of her father, all for the sake of money and his own selfish greed." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the gallery as I laid bare the horrific details of Duncan's murder, every raw emotion bubbling to the surface. Betrayal, anguish, unbridled fury. By the time I had finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, save for Mark's, his expression twisted into a sneer of contempt. "You're delusional, Eloise," he spat once I had retaken my seat. "I didn't kill anyone. This is all just a sick ploy to take me down, to take everything I've worked for." His outburst was met with stony silence, the weight of the irrefutable proof against him rendering his protestations utterly meaningless. Even his own lawyer looked pained, offering up a feeble defense that did little to sway the tidal wave of evidence. As the prosecution rested its case, an uneasy hush fell over the courtroom, the jury's departure to deliberate marking the calm before the inevitable storm. Jenna reached over and gave my hand a reassuring squeeze, a silent show of solidarity as we braced for the verdict that would forever seal Mark's fate. The oppressive silence dragged on for what felt like an eternity, tension mounting with every passing second. Then, at long last, the jury filed back in, their solemn expressions betraying nothing. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge intoned, his grave tone belying the magnitude of the moment. The foreman rose, clutching the damning slip of paper with a trembling hand. "We have, Your Honor." Mark's Adam's apple bobbed convulsively as he swallowed hard, his bravado nowhere to be found in the face of his impending judgment. Jenna and I leaned forward unconsciously, every muscle taut with anticipation. "On the charge of manslaughter in the first degree, we find the defendant, Mark Lawton." The foreman paused, and in that endless moment, time itself seemed to grind to a halt. "Guilty." A collective exhalation swept through the courtroom as the weight of the words settled upon Mark's hunched shoulders. Guilty. No more denials, no more desperate attempts to wriggle free from the vice of his own misdeeds. He was well and truly caught, the bloody consequences of his greed and malice laid bare for all to see. Jenna dissolved into tears beside me, grief and relief intermingling in a dizzying maelstrom of emotion. But I remained stoic, betraying none of the tempest that raged within as I watched the man who had once been my brother-in-law crumple under the weight of his crimes. This was justice, long overdue. This was retribution, exacted at the highest possible cost. And though it could never undo the horrors that Mark had inflicted upon us, never restore what he had so callously stolen, it was a start, a glimmer of light piercing through the suffocating darkness of tragedy. As the bailiffs led a shell-shocked Mark away in shackles, I knew our fight was far from over. The road to healing stretched out before us, pocked with obstacles and old wounds yet to fully mend. But we would face it head-on, bolstered by the strength that had carried us this far, the resilience of survivors rising from the ashes of devastation, determined to craft a new beginning from the rubble of our shattered pasts. And Mark? Let him rot behind bars, a living embodiment of the wages of sin. His world had crumbled to dust, just desserts for the monster who had traded his soul for the trappings of greed. My world, in contrast, was just beginning to rebuild, a future forged from the fires of hard-won justice and an unbreakable thirst for redemption. The courtroom was a powder keg of tension, every seat filled to capacity as the crowd buzzed with anticipation. Jenna and I sat ramrod straight in the front row, flanked by a phalanx of media crews angling for the perfect shot of the day's proceedings. Mark was led in, his wrists bound in steel cuffs that jangled with each reluctant step. Gone was the bravado that had once been his armor, replaced by a haunting expression that betrayed the depths of his moral decay. As the bailiff called for order, a hush fell over the gallery, a suffocating silence that seemed to press in from all sides. Even the spectators' breathing grew shallow, as if the entire room was holding its collective breath. The judge's entrance was heralded by a sharp rap of the gavel, the staccato sound cutting through the tension like a knife. He was an imposing figure, his stern countenance betraying none of the gravity of the moment as he cast his gaze over the courtroom. "Mark Lawton," he intoned, his voice ringing with solemn authority. "This court has found you guilty of manslaughter in the first degree, as well as numerous counts of fraud, tax evasion, and racketeering. In light of the overwhelming evidence presented and the callous nature of your crimes, I am left with little recourse but to impose the harshest possible sentence." A strangled gasp escaped Mark's lips as the weight of the judge's words settled upon his shoulders. Beside me, Jenna's fingers dug into the meat of my arm, her knuckles white with barely suppressed emotion. "For the premeditated murder of your own brother, Duncan Gibbons, I hereby sentence you to 35 years in a maximum security prison with no possibility of parole." A ripple of murmurs cascaded through the crowd, quickly swelling into a roar of approval as the reality of Mark's fate sank in. He would spend the remainder of his days behind bars, a lifetime of regret and self-loathing his only company. Furthermore, the judge continued, his voice cutting through the din like a steel blade, you are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $10 million to Mrs. Eloise Gibbons and her daughter, Mia, compensation for the grievous suffering you have inflicted upon this family through your reprehensible actions. My heart stuttered in my chest as the judge's words washed over me. $10 million, more than enough to ensure a lifetime of financial security for Mia and I, a future free from the specter of want that had haunted us since Duncan's passing. Mark, however, reacted as if he'd been struck, his face contorting into a mask of impotent rage. You can't do this to me, he bellowed, surging forward against the restraining grip of the bailiffs. I'm Mark goddamn Lawton. I'm owed that money, that life. The judge's eyes narrowed to mere slits as he glared down his nose at the pathetic figure before him. You are owed nothing, Mr. Lawton, save for the consequences of your own vile deeds. This ruling is final and binding. You would be wise to accept it with what little dignity remains to you. With a curt nod, he banged his gavel, sealing Mark's fate with a finality that reverberated through the courtroom. As the bailiffs wrestled the raging, spittle-flecked man from the room, I felt an immense weight lift from my shoulders, the burden of anguish and uncertainty that had weighed me down for so long. It was over, truly, utterly over. The man who had destroyed my world, who had torn my family asunder in his relentless pursuit of wealth and status, was nothing more than a footnote now, a cautionary tale relegated to the dustbin of history. Jenna pulled me into a fierce embrace, her body racked with sobs of relief and liberation. We did it, she choked out against my shoulder. That bastard is finally going to pay for what he did. I held her tightly, offering what little comfort I could as the euphoric reality of our victory washed over us. For months we had fought tooth and nail for this moment, this reckoning, and now that it had arrived, the gravity of our achievement was nearly overwhelming. As the crowd churned and cheered around us, united in righteous triumph, I couldn't help but steal a final glance at the doorway through which Mark had been unceremoniously dragged. He was nothing but a specter of malice now. His wretched hubris and greed reduced to ashes and ignominy. My family's name had been avenged, our honor restored through sheer force of will and an unshakable thirst for justice. The future that had once seemed so bleak and uncertain was now brimming with possibility, a new dawn rising from the ashes of tragedy. And in that moment, as I held Jenna close and drank in the sounds of vindication echoing through the courtroom, I knew that Duncan's spirit could finally rest in peace, avenged by the unbreakable bonds of love and loyalty that had ultimately triumphed over the darkness. The crisp autumn breeze carried the scent of change as I stood in the doorway of our home, surveying the chaos of renovation that had consumed the living room. Dust motes danced in the streaks of golden sunlight filtering through the plastic sheeting, a reminder of the fresh start that awaited us beyond the disarray. "Mom, look!" Mia's voice rang out from amid the clutter, her face alight with excitement. In her small hands she clutched a tarnished photo frame, its once gleaming surface dulled by years of neglect. "It's that old picture of you and Dad." A pang of bittersweet nostalgia tugged at my heart as I crossed the room to join her, gently taking the frame from her grasp. Duncan's warm smile beamed back at me, an echo of happier times before the darkness had descended upon our lives. "He would be so proud of you, you know," I murmured, brushing a stray lock of hair from Mia's forehead, "of the incredible young woman you've become, in spite of everything we've been through." Her eyes shone with a mixture of joy and melancholy as she leaned into my embrace. "I miss him every day, Mom, but at least now we can finally start to heal, right? To move forward, like he would have wanted." I blinked back the tears that threatened to spill over, overwhelmed by the depth of her wisdom and resilience. After months, years even, of suffocating anguish and upheaval, we had finally reached the other side, battered but unbroken. "You're right, honey," I said, pressing a tender kiss to the crown of her head. "It's a new beginning for us, a chance to build something beautiful from the wreckage of the past." As if on cue, a sharp rap at the front door echoed through the house, heralding the arrival of the contractors we had hired to spearhead the renovations. I cast one final, lingering glance at Duncan's image before gently setting the frame aside. "Why don't you go get started on your homework?" I suggested, offering Mia an encouraging smile. "I'll handle the crew, and we can order your favorite pizza for dinner, okay?" Her face lit up at the prospect, and she scampered off towards her bedroom without a second thought, the burdens of grief and trauma momentarily forgotten in the simple joys of childhood. With a fortifying breath, I turned to greet the contractor, steeling myself for the onslaught of chaos and disruption that would surely follow. But this time, I wasn't dreading the upheaval. I was embracing it, welcoming the opportunity to reshape our living space into a sanctuary untainted by the specter of Mark's villainy. Over the next few weeks, our home became a whirlwind of activity, a hive of bustling workers and the incessant drone of power tools. Yet amid the turmoil, I found solace in watching our new reality take shape, each fresh coat of paint and newly installed fixture serving as a cathartic exorcism of the past. Slowly but surely, the darkness that had once consumed us began to recede, banished by the vibrant hues and open, airy spaces we had chosen to welcome light and positivity into our lives once more. And then, one crisp autumn morning, it was finally finished. The last vestige of the old, haunted house stripped away to reveal the stunning oasis we had crafted from the ashes. As I wandered through the transformed rooms, running my fingertips along the sleek countertops and basking in the warm, natural light, a profound sense of peace washed over me. This was our new beginning, our fresh start, a haven forged from the fires of adversity and an unshakable thirst for healing. The specter of Mark's betrayal still lingered in the shadows, a wound that would never fully close, but its grip on us had finally been broken. As Mia bounded through the door after school, her delighted squeals echoing off the pristine walls, I knew that we had achieved something truly remarkable. Not just a physical transformation, but a metamorphosis of the spirit, an evolution from victims to survivors to warriors reborn. In that moment, I silently paid tribute to Duncan's memory, to the man whose love and sacrifice had been the catalyst for our extraordinary journey. Though he was gone, his essence lived on in the strength and resilience that had carried us through our darkest days, and in the unbreakable bond between mother and daughter that not even the most heinous evil could sever. The road ahead would be long, paved with endless ups and downs and old wounds yet to fully heal. But we would face it head-on, bolstered by the knowledge that we had already slain the greatest demon of all, and emerged victorious, our spirits intact and our futures brimming with endless possibility.